With the impending weather, I'm sort of glad that we only have classes on Tuesday. So I look smart for doing it that way when that wasn't, well, to be honest, that was part of the reason for doing it, just because things come up one way or another, whether they be pandemic related or on a personal level or weather related. Today we're going to start talking about JavaScript interaction via forms, okay? And we're going to start off with a very simple example, and then we'll sort of build from there. And we'll have another sort of example, probably a bigger example. Then we'll just keep getting bigger and bigger next week. So we'll see how far we get today, and then we'll continue next Monday. I have a page. That's here. That allows the user to enter their choice of a background color, foreground color, and it's going to change this paragraph to the new values. All right. So if I make the background color blue and the foreground color yellow and hit the button, it changes it to blue with yellow text. We can pick really ugly color combinations. Oh, that's not that bad. Try to make it worse. Yeah, it's a little hard to read. So we can make whatever color combination we want. If we enter in something that is not a color, what do you suppose it's going to do? It doesn't change it. Which logically, think about this, it makes sense. If in CISS232 you created a web page and you said the background color was blue, but you spelled blue wrong, B-L-O-O, let's say, all right, what would it do? CSS would just ignore that. Doesn't blow up, doesn't give you an error. It just is going to ignore it. So if you give an invalid value for an attribute, the attribute just doesn't do anything, doesn't change. So if you put that in your CSS that way, if you change it via JavaScript that way, it's going to do the same thing. Now, what about we put in the hex codes? Not what I wanted. That works well, because of course we can represent colors with hex codes or color names. Now, what happens if we don't put anything in there? We get an error to say we must enter something for foreground color. All right. Now we might change this later on. Maybe we just don't change it if we don't enter anything. But I wanted to show validation. I put that in there. So it displays an error message. Let's say I don't put anything for both of them. Oh, gives us an error message, gives us a different one. Instead of saying must enter something in foreground color, tells us the two values must be different. Well, I don't like the wording of that. Maybe we'll try to correct that. But at the very least, it doesn't let you do. All right. So that's what we're going to look at today. And we're going to start assuming that the user enters in the values correctly. So that's going to be our assumption initially. When we first run it, we're going to look through and we're going to forget about validation for a minute. We're just going to blow right past it. And we'll look at what happens. And what happens is going to be very similar to what we did in previous class. Because we're doing sort of the same thing we did in previous class. We're pointing to a specific thing on the screen saying this. This paragraph. What about that paragraph? Change the background color. What do we change the background color to? Well, we pull it from the form. That's something that's a little bit new. What about the foreground color? We do the same thing and change it. So we point to the paragraph and change some of its attributes. Okay, let's look at the code for this. So I come here and on my button, notice the input type is button and not submit button. We don't use submit button if we want to trigger JavaScript for the most part, unless we want to submit the form. And in this case, we're not submitting the form to the server. The server is not changing the color. The client is changing the color, which makes sense because why bother the server on the other end to do something as small as changing the color of the page? The client can do that just as well. So when we click on the button, we call this function change color. And we give it no arguments. All right. Remember, arguments are what are enclosed in parentheses. They're additional information, like what we're going to use, what specific things are we going to change? More information about the function. So let's go up and let's look at change color. First thing we get is if validate form. What does that mean, if validate form? Yeah. Exactly. It's pointing to another function, validate form, which, see here? And that function's either going to return a true or a false. All right, a Boolean value. And if that Boolean value is true, then we're going to go and execute these statements. If the Boolean value is false, then we're not going to execute those statements. So if the form validates, that is, we put something in both those fields, then we're going to make the change. If it doesn't change, that, or if they don't enter in something valid, we're not going to make the change. Okay. So we're going to assume this returns a true. All right. The rest of it is pretty simple. We've done this last week. We're going to find the thing on the page that has an ID of changeable. That's what document get element by ID changeable says. Find the thing on the page that has an ID of changeable. And that is this paragraph here. Remember, IDs need to be unique. So therefore, there can't be two things on the page called changeable. All right. If there were two things we wanted to change, we'd have to take a different approach. All right. And we could do it a couple different ways. I'm not going to get into that right now. But this is based on the fact that IDs are unique. So this is the paragraph we want to change. What do we want to change about it? We want to change its style. What about the style? We want to change its background color. What about, what do we want to change it to? The value of document, get element by ID, text BG dot value. Which, if we look at it, that is the ID of this text box. So we can use get element by ID with form elements, just like we have used it for other things, right? So I point to that. How do I pull the value of a text box? Point to the text box and ask for the value, dot value. If I remove this, what do you think is going to happen? Here's where JavaScript is funny. We probably know it's not going to work, right? Because we want the value for it. If we do this, it's going to return the whole text box object. And you can't set a color to a text box, or you can't set a color to a text box object. So it's going to not work. Whether it actually gives us an error or just tries it and fails, I'm not sure off the top of my head. Let's try it out. Oh, that's not good. I guess there's a third option. Did it give us an error? No, it didn't. Console. But it made it use white for the background color. I don't know why it did that, but it did it. Clearly it's wrong because we typed in blue there. So at any rate, we're not using the whole text box to set the color. We're only using the value that we pull from it. Whoops. Now there's another way to refer to form values, and sometimes it's easier to use the second way. All right. For some things, it doesn't matter. For other things, it's easier to use the second one. So let's look at W3 schools and find the other way of referring to form fields. All right, and that's using this syntax. And we'll talk a little bit about this syntax. And we'll change one of them to using this syntax just so that you can see it in action. So it looks like this. And again, it's important that you get a sense of how to read this. All right. Document means on the page. Get element by ID means find the thing on the page that has this ID. Then either we're going to change an HTML attribute or we're going to change a style attribute. All right. And then we change that particular attribute. In this case, document means on the page. Dot form, meaning on the page, there's a form somewhere. All right. And that form is called my form. Well, I didn't call my form anything, so I have to make that change right off to give the form a name. Then F name and then value. And it's not F name, it is text BG. I'm going to put this in and we're going to run it, make sure that it works. So I'm not lecturing about a bug. Okay, let's type in green and white, and it works. Believe it or not, I can be 100% sure that I've typed it in right, and I'm still happy when I see that it works, that there wasn't just something that I forgot or, you know, my finger hit the wrong key or something like that. All right. Let's look at this again. On the page is looking for the form that has a name, my form. And specifically, it's looking for a element on that form called text BG. So what on the page has what form on the page has the name my form? This one. What thing on the page has a name of text BG? This one does. Now, notice that these are using the name, not the ID. All right. That's something that's a little bit tricky sometimes. All right. And it really comes in handy when you're doing like radio bots. All right, but we'll talk about those later on, probably next time. All right. Now it's funny. Why do we need to specify the name of the form? Well, because a page can actually have multiple forms on it. All right. You might have on the same page a login form and a register or create an account form. Sometimes they do that side by side. If you have a password, log in here. If you don't have a password, enter this in to register. So it's possible to have more than one form on a page. So you have to say which form that you want. That's why the word form is plural in document.forms, because you might have more than one. In reality, document.forms is an array. All right. And it's an array that we access not by index, like the number 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4, but it's an array that we can access by name. All right. My form. And that form itself is an array. All right. And every form element is an element of that array. So we can access that by its name. Now, interestingly enough, we can actually, if we want to, access it by its position in the array. That forms is the first array, is the first form on the page. There's only one on this page, so it's sub-0. The text box is the first element in the array for that form, so it's also sub-0. So, unless I'm having a tough morning and didn't have enough coffee, this ought to work just as well. It does. All right. Now, if that was a little confusing to you, don't worry about it. Just remember how you have to use it. Just remember that you can use the names. So, my form. Now, here's a question. When right, I want to use the numerical subscript for the elements in the form instead of the name. Any thoughts on that? What if I wanted to loop through everything? All right. What if I wanted to loop through everything in the form? And let's say I had 10 text boxes. In fact, for fun, it depends on the time. Maybe we'll do that. If not, you can try that at home. All right. This is the opposite of the TV show Mythbusters. I'm not going to say don't try it at home. I'm going to say try it at home. Because you really can't hurt yourself or the computer by writing bad JavaScript. All right. If you're looping through it, then if you had, let's say, 10 text fields on the page, all right, you could, instead of writing 10 if statements that said this, you could loop through them and just have a very concise loop that tests each element in succession, all right, and make sure that is valid. That way, if you added another one, you wouldn't have to change the JavaScript, which is pretty cool. All right. So at any rate, that's this part, the change color function. The idea is the same as we've done in previous classes. We find the thing on the page with an ID, and we change its attribute. The one difference here is we found 2 ways to find that thing on the page, or 3 ways if you count numerical. All right. We found the get element by ID, and we've also found the document.forms syntax. Now let's look at the validate form function. All right. First of all, this validate form function sets be valid to true. There's a variety of conditions here. If any of them occur, we set b value to false. And then we return that value to whoever called it. So over here, we call that function. The function does its thing, initializes be valid to true, runs through these things, and decides whether it's valid or not. If one of these conditions are true, it changes the be valid flag to false, meaning it's not valid. If none of them, if one of them are true, it changes it to false. If none of them are true, if none of them are true, it keeps it as true, be valid. Well, that's confusing. Let's try one more time. Take 2. All right. If one of these if statements is true, it changes the value of be valid to false. That means we have an error. These are testing to see if we have an error. If none of these conditions are true, then we don't have any errors, and therefore we don't change be valid to false. Therefore, by the time we get here, be valid still has a value of true. Okay. Why do we do it that way? Could we do it the other way? Could we assume that the form is invalid and write our if statements to look to make sure that everything is correct? Could we? The answer to could we is very frequently yes, we could. All right? Not always, but for the kind of questions I'm going to ask in class, yeah, we probably could. Why don't we do it that way? Is it just a preference? No. Think about it. In order for this form to be valid, several conditions all have to be true. That is harder to test for than testing 3 conditions. If only one of those conditions is true, then it's invalid. So it's easier to assume that the form is valid and look to see if it's invalid, all right, than assume that it's invalid and make sure that everything is okay on it. It would be like if you're grading a test of 100 mathematical problems that someone gives you. Give you a test of 100 addition problems. And you have to decide whether the person got 100% on that test or not. You don't care about the grade, just whether they got 100% or not. All right? Which would it be easier to do? You're going to assume that they have 100%. As soon as they find one, then that's wrong, then they don't have 100%. You can move on. It could be the first problem, the second problem, whatever. All right? So we assume that it is the form is valid. I then clear out these two text fields called error text BG and error text FG. Those are spans that are right next to the text field that the error is for. That's what we showed before. If I omit something, I get the error message right alongside of it. All right. So these are those. This is the span error text foreground. This is the span error text background. Or this one's foreground, the other one's background. Oh, my error message is wrong. We'll correct that. Oh, no, the error message isn't wrong. It's just running together. Must enter something, then foreground color. It'd be nice to do something with this, right? To make it stand out from this. But we'll talk about that in a second. So these are the place to put the error messages. Notice I'm putting the error messages right on the page. All right. Your alternative to that is popping up an alert window. All right. What's wrong with popping up an alert window? Y'all know what an alert is, right? It pops up a little box in the middle of the page. And it's called a modal window because you have to answer that before you can continue on with the page. What is wrong with doing that, popping up an alert? Yes. Exactly. Depending on how it's written, all right, if you use alerts, oftentimes, if you don't write some good code, if you use alerts, often it will give you one error at a time, which means if you have 100 form fields on your page and 10 of them are wrong, it's going to flash you 10 alerts saying field 8 is wrong, field 12 is wrong, and so on down the line. All right. The other option is it can only tell you one error and ignore the rest. So it might tell you the first error. That's another way I've seen it coded. Both of those are kind of yucky options for the user. All right. Because the user doesn't want to see a bunch of errors flashing in their face, and the user doesn't want to see just the first error. All right. You know, that drives me crazy. And I've actually seen it on professional websites where I forget to enter something, hit submit, it tells me, okay, field A is wrong. I enter in field A, I click submit, it tells me field B is wrong. It's like, why didn't you tell me that the first time? You know, because it wasn't written well. So because of that, I'm putting the error message right on the page. All right, right on the page. And I'm putting it right next to the field that has a problem. All right, I'm going to do something that don't tell my CISS232 class. I'm going to put break tags here. Because generally speaking, break tags are to be avoided. But I'm just doing that so we don't run into the problem like we did before of the error message running alongside the label and confusing me. All right. Another way we could do that similar thing is by changing the CSS for that error span. Make it italics and red, right? Remember, we wouldn't just want to make it red because some people are colorblind and can't see red. Therefore, make it italics and red. That way, there's two visual cues. If you can't see the red color, you can at least see the italics. So the bottom line is every time we hit submit, we start by blanking out these. If we didn't do that, then the error message would remain, all right, even as we entered in a valid value. So we clear out those error messages. How do we clear out those error messages? We set the inner HTML of those error messages. This will probably be one of the last times I go through the whole thing with get element by ID. On the web page, or something has an ID, error text BG. We're going to set the inner HTML to spaces. What is the inner HTML? It is the code between start tag and end tag. So if I set the inner HTML of error text FG, is actually replacing whatever is in there now with the error message. So let's say there's a value in there to start. I'll make a more intelligible one. I wouldn't suggest that you do this, but at least this makes a little bit of sense. Errors will be shown here, errors will be shown here. So if I didn't clear it out, then that will still be there. So I type in, I go and enter that, then the error messages get blanked out. I then type in something valid. Then it clears out those error messages each time. So that's something important to do, is to clear out, if you're displaying an error message or something like that, clear out. Now, there's another way. There's always another way to do something, right? There's another way I can set the text in those spans that we'll leave until next time. All right? Okay. Now, I've cleared out the error messages. I now have an if statement. And I ask if document get element by ID dot value equals an empty string. If that is true, then I set the value of the error text to must enter something, and we have a problem. Be valid as false. However, I'm going to let it run through the other tests too, because I want to show all the errors that this has, not just the one error. I look to see if document get element by ID text FG value equals an empty string. Finally, I look to see if the two colors are the same, because we wouldn't want the user to do that. Don't want the user to be able to do that. Right? And then it returns the value of b valid to whoever called it, which is up here, and then it decides whether you change colors or not. In all cases, if there's a problem, it sets the error message and then sets the be valid to false. Now, I'm going to pick apart this function. Are there any questions over that, what we have right now? All right, let me pick this apart a little bit. All right, we already saw this. Must enter something, two values must be different. I don't like that error message because the two values aren't the same, right? They're both the same. So therefore, I should say for the foreground color must enter anything. Let's look at the code and see how we could change our if statements to accommodate that. Any thoughts? Go ahead. Yes, we could do that. We could put an extra condition here. And then we could test to see if this is equal to an empty or not equal to an empty string, or this not equal to an empty string. That's one way to do it, and that's a fine way to do it. I'm not going to say there's anything wrong with that. I wouldn't necessarily like that because that's a complicated condition, and it's I won't say it's easy to write, but it is likely to be confusing to some people. So what I would do, another way to do it would be to slap an else here. I'm only going to evaluate this condition if there's something in the second color. Now it says must enter something, must enter something. There's something in here and not in the first. Yeah, that's a reasonable error message to say, because there's nothing wrong with blue. That someone enters something in there. All right. So cool. Another thing that's wrong. What if I don't leave it empty, but instead I put spaces in there? Tells me two values must be different because I put a different number of spaces in there. Let's be more diligent here, and we'll put 3 spaces. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2. There we go. Must have got an extra one in there somewhere. All right. It should give me an error, even though I entered the spaces. Why? Because empty string isn't necessarily a really good test. All right. Yeah, an empty string is an invalid value, but there is, if there's white space, if there's spaces, then it's not valued. So what can we do about that? Well, JavaScript has a function called trim. And what it does is it removes the white space on either side. So for example, we have hello world. Notice we put a bunch of spaces in here and run, doesn't show them. Well, it wasn't in HTML anyhow, because they ignore white space. Anyhow, just trust me, it removes the spaces. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put on each of these things not trim. Equals an empty string. Oh, I didn't read what that said, thought it was displaying an error message the first time. You know, I'm sort of having a rough day today. All right. Does anyone have me in the afternoon class too? Okay. I hope I'll be better by then. All right. So now if we don't put it, if we put spaces in, it's smart enough to know that a bunch of spaces is just the same as not anything. There's one more problem that I actually just thought of here. What if I type this in? Well, let's make it easy. White. All right. Same color, right? It's two different representations of the color white. What's going to happen here? Am I going to get an error or am I not going to get an error? And what's the result of this? Think of what the code looks like. In fact, I'll show you the code. You're going to pass validation? Yes, it will. All right. Why? Because there's not an empty string in text 1. There's not an empty string in the second text field. And the values of those two strings are not the same. One of them is white, one of them is $FFFFF. All right. Therefore, it's not the same. And it is going to not pass validation, and therefore it's going to make the background color white and the text color white. Right? I'll tell you what, this is my mandatory one time a week where I talk about how it was in the old days. Got to do that like at least once a week, right, to keep my license. When I first started programming, all right, we used punch cards, right? You probably have seen punch cards. They're like cardboard cards, and you typed on a key punch machine that punches little holes in them that correspond to letters. Well, we did that, all right? And then we put our program in the card reader and ran it. And sometime later, we would get an answer, all right? I went to Cleveland State, and at the beginning of the semester, sometime later, might have been, 10 minutes later, all right? That was a good day. If you got your output back in 10 minutes, you were celebrating, all right? Only to find that you forgot a period somewhere, all right? Or you spelled int wrong, or whatever. So guess what we did a lot of? And then again, at the end of the semester, it literally would be, you would submit it today, you would get it back the next day. All right, you would submit it, and it would take, 6-8 8 hours to run, and you would come back the next day. It's wild. And I mean, while it's clearly a lot better now because things run so fast, it sort of encourages students to be a little sloppy in their coding, because an error is not as catastrophic as it was to me, right? Because if I got an error, I wasted X number of hours waiting to get the results. If you get an error, you've wasted 2 milliseconds, all right? Which isn't that bad. So what we got good doing, and the same thing with logic errors, by the way. The same thing with logic errors. So what we got good with doing is sort of, and there's a name for this, but you play the computer. And you would think, like if this were a program like this, what happens if, you know, they enter in a space and an empty string? What would it work? And I'd trace through, I'd say, yeah, okay, this one would be true, so it would set B value. And I'd trace through, all right, and make sure that I got the answer that I thought by just paper checking it. You know, you'd actually create a sheet of paper and write the variable names and go in and put all that in. What's the point of all this? All right, the point of all this is, in a way, something is lost without doing that, because you have people now, and again, I'm not criticizing younger people. I'm talking about even me. All right, now that we have this luxury of really fast CPUs, you'll just try something. What if, you know, I got an error on that? Let's try putting a semicolon at the end. All right. It says that it is missing a semicolon. Oh, let's stick it here. Oh, it doesn't work. Let's move it here, you know. So you kind of guess at things and take a stab. I encourage you to read through your programs and try to figure out what the computer is doing. Play computer and say, if I enter a 10 here and I selected penny, what's the path the program is going to take? All right. Is it going to do what I expect it to do? All right. That's a good skill to have, even though it's not a necessity because of the fast CPU times, but it really is a good skill to have, to be able to trace through the anticipated execution of a program. Now, about this, there's a lot of colors that have color names. I could test for this specific condition if they entered in white and they entered in $FFFFF. But you know what? What are all the HTML color names? There's a bunch of them. I would have to test. If they entered in Alice blue in 1 and $F0, F8, FF, antique white, aqua, aquamarine, you know, there's a bunch of color names you'd have to test. And at this point, as a software developer, I'm going to say, I'm not going to bother correcting this problem. If they do something like this, they're probably being a wise guy and they get what they deserve. All right. That sounds harsh, but I would say that this is an error that I know about and I can live with it. And that's, I think, something that's sort of important, to be able to look at your code, because we want our code to be perfect, but we're also have practical constraints on us. All right. So therefore, we knew that this would be a problem based on the fact that we traced through it, but we chose not to address it. And I would, if I was a developer in this case, I would put a comment in there saying that we know that if you entered in the hex code and the color name, and they happen to match, that the air trapping won't catch it. But we chose not to address it because of practical issues. That way, whoever gets to maintain the program won't cuss you out too badly when they see that error. All right. Are there any questions? All right, we'll see you over in lab.